Hello everyone. Good afternoon. It's officially afternoon now. Thank you everyone for joining us for our second plenary session of the State of Lake Huron Conference. Hopefully everyone's staying on their toes. I don't think the coffee has ran out yet there, so please know that there's a session this afternoon, technical session, and then this evening we have some activities planned. Come back to this room for some pizza and a little bit of a wrap-up if you want to stay. We're also going to be showing a movie in here as well, and field trip sign up if you really want to get out tomorrow and stretch your feet and go see some cool things. Stop at the registration table. So we have a few things planned during the plenary, so please enjoy the show. And lunch again is going to be down in the same area we were yesterday. So the first part of our plenary is just really allowing us to throw a bunch of information at you about the state of Lake Huron. And this sort of stems from really the template of the State of Lake Michigan program is, let's sort of keep assimilating as much information as we can about what we've heard. And Liz LaPlante from the US EPA is going to attempt to do that for us pretty fast, and she's the program manager for the LaMP program for Lake Huron. So, Liz.
Thanks, Ed. I'm going to whip through this pretty fast because I know we're on a really short time frame. So, first off, I wanted to thank everyone for coming to this. This is the first ever Lake Huron IAGLR State of Lake Conference, and it follows on the first LaMP for Lake Huron ever. So this shows that we are really increasing the visibility of Lake Huron. It's no longer going to be the forgotten lake. And you guys are all part of this, and we're going to make this much higher visibility and much higher in importance. And if you haven't read the LaMP, I highly recommend that you do that. If you can only read a little bit, read the actions. I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. But make no mistake, all of you who have been toiling in anonymity over the last 4 or 5 years, your work counts. It really does. We are not only going to use it for the CSMI, we're using it in the LaMP, and we're using it to do actions to protect, restore, and maintain Lake Huron. So I just want to give kudos to all of you. It's a new day in Lake Huron, and you guys are part of it. So very quickly, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the state of the lake ecosystem. I'll talk a little bit about the LaMP, CSMI, and then kind of next steps. So what is the LaMP? Let's go back, and I know some of you in the work group are rolling their eyes. We've seen this before. But I want to impress upon you that before 2012, the LaMPs were really not at the level they are at now. The 2012 Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement Amendment purposefully elevated the LaMPs up here. So they are now the main strategy for how we protect, restore, and maintain the Great Lakes. So if you have children who don't understand what mommy and daddy do, you say, you know what, I'm putting together the main plan for how we're going to protect your lake. That's what the LaMP is. And it was specifically elevated in the agreement. It's right there, Annex 2. There's a lot of annexes. I won't go through those, although the science annex is very important to this group in here. So Lakewide management, what is this? Well, it's an open process to answer, how's the lake doing? What is stressing the lake? That's where you guys come in. I mean, we've been sitting through 2 days of hearing what is happening to the lake, what's stressing it. I mean, and the level and the quality of the presentations have just been amazing. And you guys are creating new information in real time. And then what additional actions are necessary? That's where the LaMP comes in and the LaMP work group. And I'll talk about that in a second. So what you guys are doing, are you giving information to the policymakers and the people that are going to be doing government interventions and to matching the funding to what you're finding. It's also a Lakewide mechanism to help coordinate taking action and tracking progress and challenges. I will also add to this, ears perk up, resources. Because now we have resources because of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. I don't know if the congressman is going to be here while I talk about this, but it's a binational supported effort. How many things are, bipartisan? How many things are bipartisan these days? This is supported by both sides of the aisle on the U.S. side. They think it's that important that they put this funding to the cleaning up the Great Lakes. Not only that, but Action Plan 3, anyone know what Action Plan 3 is? Everyone know? Yeah, it's bureaucraties, but it basically is the action plan that tells us how we're going to use the GLRI funding. It's every 5 years we put a new action plan out there. Guess what the Action Plan 3 includes this year? And it's because of a lot of the LAMP members. The LAMP. It said, if you're going to fund projects, you doggone have to be sure to align it with LAMP priorities. It's in the action plan. So that means if you guys have projects and actions, make sure they align with the LAMP, bring them forth through your agency process or talk to me, and we can see about getting them funded. One thing I'm a little puzzled about is there is, 43 actions in the LAMP. And we need projects. We need projects to be given forth so that we can fund them. And so far, there's not been a lot of projects given forth to implement the LAMP. One of the things I'm going to talk about, I'm going to embarrass Breton, but Breton Jordan Small has been trying to do a restoration of Saginaw Bay Reef for a long time. We put it in the LAMP, and actually it was one of the priority actions. And even before the LAMP was finalized, we got the go-ahead to fund it. And it hadn't been funded for many years, right, Breton? And it got funded, and it was just completed. So I just want to put a marker in there. If you have projects out there and that align with the Lake Huron LAMP, which means you're going to have to read the LAMP, you need to be putting them forward. We have money, okay? So what does the LAMP say about lake conditions, stressors, and actions being taken? Let's talk about that. So overall, we have this thing called the State of Lake Huron. We have this report. It comes out every 3 years. We present it at what's called the Binational Forum. We just had that in June. Overall, the state of Lake Huron is fair and unchanging. So it's not as, Lake Erie is poor, Lake Superior is good. We're right in the middle. So that doesn't mean that everything is fair. As you can see on this chart, there are some parts that are red. Guess which part that is? Invasive species. And some parts are good, green. There's a lot of intact water, habitat. But overall, it's fair, and the trend is unchanging. This is just talking about the 9 general objectives in the Water Quality Agreement. You can look them up. There's 9 of them. We just go through, and there's a ton of science behind this, and I'm not going to run through this. But as you can see, the poor is right now, it's invasive species. And so, we can go that. You can look at it to your heart's content. All right, let's run through this really quickly. Luckily, drinking water and beaches, Lake Huron is still a source of very high drinking water, and the beaches are normally open for recreation and swimming, which is good. Toxic contaminants and fish advisories. So, as we all know, chemical contaminants are much lower than they were in the 70s. They're still high enough to cause fish advisories, especially with regard to mercury, PCB, and dioxins. We also have to keep an eye on the emerging contaminants, PFAS, PFOA, and microplastics. So that's something that the LAMP hopefully will continue to take on. The nutrients and algae. So the nutrients are declining in the offshore, phosphorus is, whereas near shore there's still a lot of algae problems. Loss of habitat and native species. So although there's a lot of intact habitat near Georgian Bay, there's also a lot of loss of habitat near Saginaw Bay. And native species, we heard a lot of presentations, and you guys have given a lot of the presentations. They're still declining, some of the native species, and obviously invasive species is one of the biggest problems. This is the round goby. We also have the sea lamprey and the mussels, although some of the good news that we've been hearing over the last couple days is that the sea lamprey strikes are down and near target. Some of the other things that I've heard is this is in real time now, thanks to Steve Riley and his group, but bloater seems to be increasing. For the first time, the native recruitment of native lake trout seems to be increasing. Walleye seems to be increasing. Now, they're all still at very, very, very low levels. The one thing I thought was really interesting, too, is that looks like there's a pocket of diparia that seems to be coming back in the north part of the lake, but it's only one data point. We need more monitoring of that. So there was some good news among kind of the normal bad news. So just really quickly, just to finish up. So where are we? We're here today for two reasons. One is you guys are all reporting out from the 2017 CSMI monitoring year. So we, the policymakers, the work group that are in the room, are listening, and we're thinking, okay, what do we do with this information? Well, we're going to take this information that we hear today and this afternoon. We're going to have a workshop next, probably April, May, June timeframe, where we're really going to get down to brass tacks. I'm going to come up with the next priorities for 2021 monitoring year. In addition to that, we are going to be taking the CSMI monitoring priorities that won't be blessed by Annex 10, and we're going to consider them for the next LaMP. The next LaMP is coming out as well. We're going to start writing. Can't believe it, we just finished it, but we're going to start writing again in about a year and a half. So some of the takeaways for all of you in the room is that, one, come to the meeting this afternoon, come for the free beer and pizza, and stay for the gap analysis. We need your help in what you've heard over the last 2 days. And we want you to write down what you think the new priorities should be. And you should have gotten a sheet. If you can't be at the workshop this afternoon, fill out the sheet, give it to us. We'll follow up with that. Second thing is that we really need all hands on deck. We need to build the capacity of our work group. Our work group contains feds, tribes, indigenous folks, First Nations, states, province, but we also work with the NGOs. We work with the general public. We work with industry. We really need more bodies. I've recruited poor Bo. I demanded that he be on our team, and he is. But we're open. We don't turn anyone away. So this is a membership drive, I guess, that I'm doing as well. And finally, in summary, Lake Huron's in fair condition, unchanging. Many stressors exist. And the LaMP will outline the key actions that we're going to take to address those stressors. And for more information, you can talk to Paul Perrette, who is my co-chair in Lake Huron, or myself. Okay. Thank you. Is I in time? Okay.
Thanks, Liz. I think we just need to put you under stress of time, and you really condense a lot of information. That was really good. Today's plenary is a little bit different format. We've set it up more as a conversation discussion with two folks. Paul Sibley is the current president of IAGLR, and Mark Fisher is the CEO of the Council of the Great Lakes Region. And when I called them to talk about this plenary, I was sort of envisioning, almost like a boxing match. We're going to have the policy on one side, Mark will be in one corner, and Paul will be in the other corner, and they're going to duke it out on stage in terms of what's more important or who wins. And both of them said, well, it's not about who wins. It's really about how they work together. So we're sort of set this up for these guys to have a discussion on stage. So just imagine they're stuck together on a plane ride, and they can't leave the gate, and they're going to have to talk to each other. So maybe that's a better discussion for what the format of the plenary is. So it's a little experiment. We'll see what these guys can talk about. I think both organizations, and we've seen today, there's a lot of issues that affect both of these realms and how they work together. So I'll turn it over to these two, and they can take it over. And we'll ding the bell if it gets too ugly, okay?
I don't think I'd like the boxing match.
Okay.
There we go. I don't think I'd like the boxing match. I'm pretty sure I'd lose.
Well, I'm not so sure about that. I'm a bit of a pacifist myself. But anyways, welcome and thank you for coming. This is very low-key. It's casual, and there is a role for you to play, as you'll see in a few moments. But I thought it would be good, we thought it would be good to set the stage to kind of explain the genesis of this from the context of why it's important to IAGLR. And so I wanted to kind of place it in the context of our strategic planning process. Behind the scenes, the board of directors, some of you are in the audience, we spent a lot of time talking about the direction that IAGLR should take. And one of those is the extent to which we engage policy, because we are a research-based organization. If you've attended our main conference, and many of you have, you'll know there's a lot of very in-depth scientific talk. So we're very comfortable in the scientific realm. I've been quite impressed at this conference in that I see, and I'm starting to see, the connections that are being made between policy-driven research and the people on the ground conducting that research. And it's very, very interesting to kind of witness this. One of our strategic plans, or a part of our strategic plans, one of the goals is to increase the positive or to enhance our positive impact on policy decisions. And so this is kind of gets to Ed's point that we didn't want this to be so much of a battle, but a conversation about how we can facilitate a greater or enhanced engagement of IAGLR, largely a research-based organization, on the policy side. I think we mostly would agree that policy, at least as pertains to the Great Lakes and other areas, whether you're talking about climate change or so on, has to be based on sound science. But sound science is not the only consideration. I'm a toxicologist by trade. I do risk assessment. I generate the numbers that I put into a portfolio that I then hand off to a risk manager. I can count on one hand the number of detailed and in-depth conversations I've had with a risk manager. They have to consider these other elements, societal elements, some of which you can see listed there. So this is kind of an uncomfortable notion to a lot of researchers, that it isn't always about the science. It has to be based on sound science, but there's other things that we have to consider. So there's really a tension that exists between science, a push and a pull, if you will. And for those of you who might have grown up with Dr. Dolittle, you'll recognize the push me, pull you here, which is the animal, fictitious animal that he drew. So that's kind of the basis for our conversation. What are the mechanisms by which we can actually increase our engagement in policy while maintaining truth to our roots with respect to being a research-based organization? There are many potential mechanisms, but one of those is to build partnerships with other organizations. And this is where our relationship with the Council of Great Lakes Region comes into play, and I think you'll see that come out in some of the conversation today. We've actually signed a memorandum of understanding. That was a few months ago in the spring, I think. So we have a formal basis on which to have this relationship, and going forward we have to iron out some of the details about how we're going to engage and that sort of thing. But for us, this is one of perhaps several mechanisms that we can use to allow IAGLR to better engage on the policy side. So the role that you can play here is that rather than just listening to us go back and forth, and we're going to do that for a little bit. We have 3 questions. We generated a whole series of questions, but we've selected 3 that we can use as a basis to kind of get the conversation. But I want to prime you guys right now to think about questions that you may have in the arena of science policy relationships. And so we would invite you to kind of think about that, and maybe after 15 or 20 minutes of discussion between Mark and I, we can maybe open it up to you for some questions as well. And I risk it a little bit to say that that's open game. You can ask anything, but just kind of keep it on the science policy side of things. And maybe some of what we'll talk about, we'll cover some of that. So the first question we have then, and I'll turn it over to Mark because I've been talking a little bit too much here, is what kind of opportunities exist? I'm going to have to look at here because I can't read the screen. Exist for IAGLR to engage government and industry. So what are the mechanisms, if you will, by which we can do that, and how can we best address the differences that may arise in creating these relationships and so on? As I say, part of our strategic planning process, we've identified various elements that we can use, one of which is these relationships. So Mark, I'll turn it over to you, and you can kind of get us started on that.
Sure, and I can't remember exactly how you've ordered all these questions and whether or not the timeline question we put up as part of science and policy is part of this question. But I think when you look at broader engagement, and particularly in the Great Lakes, I think one of the biggest challenges that we see is that there are so many different relationships and networks and organizations, and that's a good thing. We've got my organization, Council of the Great Lakes Region. You've got the Great Lakes Governors and Premiers. You've got the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Cities Initiative, which is a network of mayors. You've got the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus, which is a network of state provincial lawmakers. You've got the Great Lakes Task Force federally, which Congressman Kildee sits on. You've got the Canada-U.S. Interparliamentary Group, which is another group of federal lawmakers that talk about these issues. So you can start to add up pretty fast that there are so many different groups, within industry. I didn't talk about chambers of commerce, but chambers of commerce and industry associations. There are so many groups that are in their zone, and they're talking about these issues in different ways, right? And I think the best thing that groups like IAGLR and the council that has a broad-based mandate and membership to do is to find a way of trying to interact with all of those different voices. And it takes a lot of effort, but I think we try to do that by regularly going to their events and connecting with their events. And so the outreach is important. But it's also creating opportunities like this where you can draw them into your own family. And so our event, just to give an example, the Great Lakes Economic Forum, is really our signature event for trying to bring business to the table, to try and bring academia into the conversations and different levels of government and what have you. So I think, thinking creatively about how you use this event, and it's very much a science-driven conversation and a science-driven event, which I think is great. But, having Congressman Kildee here and perhaps having others here in the future on a lake-by-lake basis really gives you an opportunity to expose them to a different conversation that they might not naturally be exposed to. And doing it in a way where, just for example, if you go to Washington or Ottawa, they're dealing with a million issues every minute, right? And so it's hard for them to really, absorb what you're telling them. So I think using these kind of forum in the future, and broadening out the audience a little bit, I think will help, create that science policy interface in perhaps a more unique way, and those relationships which are so important.
So having somebody like Mark here, who is so well connected on that side, on the policy side, with industry and with government, certainly provides, as kind of you've indicated, an opportunity for us as an association. And I know really there's some scientists, we get this a little bit in terms of feedback on our membership surveys, that aren't really comfortable with this, but many of them are. And they want to know that the good science that we have here, that we generate as scientists in IAGLR and elsewhere. I mean, this is not a problem just facing IAGLR. I've been the president of other societies, and we have the same sort of issue, how best to engage on the policy side and make that wealth of science that we have at our disposal, that you are all generating in part, made available in a more fluid way, so that you create those channels of conversation and discussion between the risk assessor and the risk manager. And I think we've all probably been in that situation where we've seen a policy that's been developed, and we look at the policy and think, but that doesn't really reflect my scientific understanding of that situation. In part, it's because other factors had to be considered. In part, unfortunately, it's also politically driven to some extent, and we may get into that in our third question a little bit, but to be able to have somebody like Mark who can make those connections and allow us to present our good science in a way that's just not insular, i.e. at our annual conference or published in our journal, those are all important. But we now have the opportunity to extend beyond that. So I think it has the potential to be a great partnership. And you can tell us where that good science can go, and who needs it.
Well, just to give you another example, I don't know if Sherry Lee from Bruce Power is in the room or not. I think she was supposed to be coming to the conference. But, we started a project with them about a year ago. It's a 3-year project where, the company is wanting to learn more about, climate change trends and risks and what it means not only for Lake Huron, but also for the broader watershed, because they obviously want to know sort of how that's going to change the way that they think about their operations. But obviously as a big company, they have an opportunity to use their investment in research to help develop knowledge that's useful for the surrounding community, whether it's the First Nation, Métis communities, farmers, coastal communities. And so, again, thinking about how the research community, is able to connect into these unique partnerships, again, whether it's government or if it's business. I'm definitely seeing an increase in companies wanting to engage in a much more dynamic way in helping them understand big and complicated problems. And in this Bruce Power project, we're doing it in partnership with the University of Toronto. And even for them, we're bringing in environmental science, we're bringing in the atmospheric side, we're bringing in the computer science side, we're bringing in the engineering side. First thing they said to me when we sat down as a project team is, we've never talked to each other before. And so even for them, within the university setting, it's become a unique project because it becomes cross-departmental, and they're able to use different resources to solve some research questions that they have as well, that happens to be relevant for the company at the same time. So trying to find some of those unique partnerships as well, I think, is another way of advancing IAGLR's agenda.
Yeah, I've been really surprised. A couple of thoughts. Even at this conference, the number of talks I've been to, at least 3 or 4, where somebody puts their hand up in the audience and says, well, were you aware of X doing Y? Well, no, we didn't know that. So already, I mean, and some of those are more on the management side, some of them are more on the scientific side. So there's connections that are made there. And this is what I'm really looking forward to with our partnership, is that you can identify the people that we need to engage with. One of the things, I mean, we're going through a federal election in Canada right now, and it is remarkable. I think for the first time that I can ever remember, even though the federal politicians are downplaying the conversation about the environment, the public is primed, especially with respect to climate change. It is the leading issue at the doorstep for most politicians. And when you've got, many of you may not know Stephen Lewis. He's an ex-leader of the NDP party in Ontario. He and David Suzuki went on a short tour in southern Ontario, mostly targeting universities, because that's where a lot of the energy for interest in climate change is being generated. But they're saying this has to be the foremost issue discussed in the election, even though it's not. It's prominent, but it's not. So there is a real growing appetite, despite, and again, we might talk about this a little bit later, despite some of the populist movement that exists out there, to start engaging more between the scientists. I mean, the science in climate change, but it could be Great Lakes we're talking about, is generated by people like ourselves in the room. And we need to have the conversations so that our politicians understand how important that there is good science to support some of the concerns that they have, and maybe it won't be ignored at the political level.
Yeah, I think just again to add to that, and I think this is probably really hard to do, but when you're getting into the very focused science that I've certainly seen yesterday and today, it's really trying to then at some point translate that into how is the general public, how is government going to absorb that information, how are they going to feed that, how are they going to feel about that information. Because obviously if you're, sort of conservative-minded or liberal-minded or for other persuasions, you may be absorbing that scientific information in different ways, right? And I think, if you want to be, especially with some of these bigger thorny issues like climate change and carbon pricing, as you think through that scientific process and what the different solutions are for moving forward, I think being able to be a bit of a translator in saying that, this is the preferred path, but there are other paths that can get you from point A to point B as well, right? And doing some of that translation, because I feel, based on my experience, if you don't do that, we run into a situation right now with carbon pricing or cap and trade where it's A or B, it's black or white, right? And so, there's a lot of science that goes into some of that decision making, but if we make it that binary and we don't give people from different political ideologies different pathways, we get into these unnecessary fights where it's like you either have to pick carbon pricing or you don't pick carbon pricing, right? So I think, as scientists that are really expert in understanding your field, I think it's, being able to also give advice about, and we know that this is going to be received differently once it gets into the public policy mix, so what are some of the different solutions and pathways that people can think about that ultimately keep you progressing forward? It might not be as fast as you'd like, but it keeps you progressing forward in some way, as opposed to making the issue so binary or black and white, where it's like you either adopt it or you don't adopt it, and then if they don't adopt it, you're stuck. And you might be stuck for 4 years, you might be stuck for 8 years, before somebody comes in and says, yeah, you know what that person said 8 years ago was right, so let's get on track with that, but you're already 8 years behind, if not more.
Yeah, I'm going to move on to the second question, but This idea of progression is so important because, again, in the face of the populist movement, and it actually was our third question to think about in that context. I'm just going to put it up here because, we really are experiencing, by some measures, unprecedented anti-elitism movements in society. That scientists are no longer one of the more trusted elements of society, that they maybe speak to truth, but it's not my truth, this sort of thing. So there's this kind of elitist viewpoint about scientists, and this is really, really frustrating. So back to your point about progression is that you kind of have to be able to parse out the noise. That is that at any one point in time, and not surprisingly, this does tend to follow political cycles. We've seen this in Ontario, we've seen this federally in Canada as well, with respect to science and how governments perceive and engage in science, that despite the fact that there are these wild swings politically, we've canceled our cap and trade and the idea of a carbon tax in Ontario over this 4-year term. I'm being optimistic here, is maybe perceived as being very, very problematic in the face of what we know about climate change. 10 years down the road, this may be back. We may have that in place. So there is this gradual progression that underlies all of this noise. And so if you're able to look at it from that perspective, you can draw some encouragement in an otherwise rather difficult environment that exists right now. And I kind of see that here. I see that when I go to talks where people are on the ground doing work based on some policy that exists, in spite of the rhetoric that you hear coming out of, whether it's Ottawa or the White House, I'm very encouraged that we're still making progress. And this is really, really important. I think you have to kind of steel yourself against some of the political climate and look at what you're actually doing. It may be a case of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but we are making progress, and I think it's a really important point.
Yeah, I think, building on that, I think getting out of, sort of mainstream politics and public policy in the sort of the centers of decision-making, Ottawa and Washington, obviously, at the federal level, I think is extremely important in being able to drive some of that change on the ground. We've heard from community foundations, we've heard about, how this network, group of scientists are connecting into some of that work. It doesn't always have to happen through and by government, right? So I think the more that you can connect with those grassroots activities, I think is super important because, sometimes you'll get into these political cycles where, I've seen Environment Canada change its name and change its mandate probably about, 6 different times over, a relatively short period of time. And so I think, when we're in that political environment, you I think, become less reliant on the predictability of government being able to respond. And so I think the more that you can build these on-the-ground networks, whether it's Lake Huron, whether it's Lake Ontario, whether it's Lake Erie, that community action and use your expertise at that level, I think some wonderful things can happen. And that can happen sometimes when not much is going on at the federal level or even the provincial level.
I'm mindful of the time here. We're at 12:35. We got a few minutes. I think maybe if we can just very quickly tackle the second question, before I jump to the third question. My guess was that the third question might incite a few responses from the audience if you care to ask questions. But we often, and this goes back to this idea that there's always a bit of tension between policy and science, and so finding that right balance. And balance, in this sense, I don't mean as 50-50. I mean a balance that is good for policymakers and for scientists, as embodied by agents or associations like IAGLR or others that I've been affiliated with. So how do we manage these kind of competing approaches? And I know you've got some thoughts on that, Mark.
Yeah, well, I think it's a really real issue, and I would certainly welcome other people's reflections on that. But the difference in the timelines, I think, between good science and public policy are very different. My time working in Ottawa and at a period of time at the highest level at the Privy Council office, which is the department that serves the Prime Minister, you're often, unless an issue has been around a long, long time and there's been some natural good policy thinking done as part of it, I think based on from what I've seen, 9 times out of 10, it's hurry up and rush, right? When you're trying to develop policy in that kind of environment, which isn't great, it's shorter term cycles, it's not long-term thinking. You're trying to grab, whatever you can from different departments and different stakeholders to try and formulate something that makes sense to people. So, we're under, the policy community is often under great pressure increasingly these days to formalize a policy response, legislative or regulatory, that is trying to capture a bit of the science, but also is being reflective of that political pressure, which is a 4-year cycle, that public pressure, which can be immediate, and that's not always a smooth process, right? So I think, what I've, tried to do, and this partly because I come from a science background, and is to really, try to spend some time obviously reflecting on it. And I know that when I'm looking at something, it's not going to be 100% precise. So I will take 60%, in terms of some scientific understanding or trends to help me think through a process, because waiting for the 100%, might be another 5 years down the road, and it's too late because I got to respond to that issue right now. And I think that's some of the biggest challenges policymakers face is how do you reflect science in your public policy, know that some of the science is still ongoing and it's not perfect, right? But you still need to respond to it, in that moment.
Yeah, it's problematic because, of course, as a scientist, we think about confidence intervals and uncertainty, and we want to characterize that uncertainty as much as possible. I know certainly in the toxicology world we want to do that because we want to make sure that whether it's an ecosystem or a human, that they are protected and they are protected well. So, but in getting to that point, we often suffer from paralysis by analysis, and we don't get that data. You're asking for the data. Says, well, we're not really comfortable releasing it yet because we need to do this, that, or the other. So I appreciate that you're operating in real time and addressing some of those non-science issues that are just very, very important to address. So there is, I don't know what the level is. You mentioned 60%, but that's just a number that could be 80%, it could be 40%. It really depends on the urgency of the situation, how you need to respond. But what people need to realize is that the science doesn't stop there. You can develop a policy, and you might not be 100% certain about the science that underpins that policy. But as the science accrues, and as more and more comes along, you can modify those policies. Political problems notwithstanding, you can modify those policies. So it's kind of an iterative process, and I think that's good. I think there's a tendency often to be very precautionary. You're familiar with the precautionary principle. Again, in my world, this tends to be very, very strong in Europe, less so in North America. The idea that you should act now and create a policy that doesn't really, it's founded on science, but you don't have a lot of certainty, but because in the minds of the people who want to implement the policy, it's urgent, it's needed, we need to do it now. But the risk is that you're going to get it wrong, or that you're going to cost an industry or maybe a government a lot of money by inducing that policy that could end up being wrong. So it's really hard to know where that balance needs to exist.
But I also think that that's where the relationship between science and policy can be stronger. And I talked about that solution set, those pathways before. I think somebody who's in a position of having to move or advance a policy idea forward, if they have those relationships on the science side, you can think through together the variations between option A, option B, option C, and sort of what's the upside downside risk, right? And trying to mitigate some of that uncertainty that it might exist on the science side. But if policymakers are doing that in absence of that relationship with the scientific community, I think there's real danger in getting it wrong. And so I think that just reinforces the importance of creating those policy science relationships going forward. And they don't always exist well in departments, right? I think every department has got science and policy managed and aligned in different ways. And you hope that at some level, somebody is bringing the two together, but, that's not always the case. But I think it's critical that those relationships get formed somewhere, whether it's in the region or, in the political capitals.
Yeah, well, again, as one of those insular scientists, I recognize the importance of these connections, and the latter stages of my career, I've been really interested in my case, risk communication. But that means talking with risk managers and the people who are involved with managing and developing policy. So we've talked for a few minutes about this science policy issue. I'd be interested to maybe hear some questions from you. We are currently waiting for our congressman to show up, so between now and...
Congressman Kildee's here.
All
right.
Sorry, I didn't notice you come in. Okay,
we won't rag the puck for too much longer. We'll just take a couple more questions, and then we'll have you up, Congressman. That's great. Thanks for being here. Mary.
Yes, I have an issue where there's a huge gap between the science and the policy right now, so I'd like to hear your advice on how to bring these together. The issue I'm talking about is the presence of grass carp right now reproducing in Lake Erie. The science is here, it's now. There's a 2017 risk assessment that showed that they pose the greatest ecological risk to all of the Great Lakes. Most people get them confused with what's happening at Chicago, but this totally separate issue. They are present, they're reproducing in 2 Ohio rivers. We have a binational management policy where the states where they are present right now should be asking for assistance to begin an eradication program. We want that eradication program to begin, but instead the 2 states with a university are undertaking research to put tags in the fish and follow their movement. That needs to end. The 2017 risk assessment showed what needs to happen. How do we make that happen now?
Yeah, well, there's, there are lots of tools in the toolbox, which isn't a great way of explaining it. But, when I've been sort of presented with those kind of situations outside of government, there's lots of levers you can pull on, whether it's media, whether it's working with local politicians. It's finding those different sources of support and activism that can elevate the understanding of the issue and create that pressure. Because sometimes you need to create that pressure. If you've got, again, when governments are working on much shorter cycles, in decision making, unless that pressure is there isn't the tendency to respond to it right away. So it's being able to create some of that friendly, pressure, through different sources, right? And depending on the issue and where it stands, again, it could be, it could be a mayor, it could be the media, it could be the media and the mayor, it could be a coalition of other NGOs working together. It's a collection, right? But you have to kind of look at it on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you, Mark, but we have done pretty well all of that. The mayor's passed a resolution at their annual meeting. The media, we've issued a press release, but the media get this confused with what's happening at Chicago. Sure. And say, look, there's millions being spent on this. How could you possibly be concerned? Yeah.
Well, to your, resolutions, they're great. They make for a great one-day story in the newspaper somewhere.
That's it. It's over.
Hey,
gone.
This town or village has passed a resolution on single-use plastics. But it has to be a bit bigger and more organized than that to be able to really get the attention. And sometimes on those kind of binational issues, that means, and you and I first met when we were talking about water levels on Georgian Bay and Lake Huron when I worked at Global Affairs, and I think that's a great example of the type of pressure that you and the Georgian Bay Association, through a very well-connected network, were able to put on the government of Canada, where in a not a very long time, made both the politicians and the departments stand up and saying, we've got to look at this, right? So you've just got to keep finding a way of creating that pressure, that coalition, that in Ottawa or Washington, that someone's going to say, you know what, we really need to be paying attention to that in a different way. And,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody's got more advice, let me know.
Well, I'll just add to that briefly. I mean, I don't work with carp or grass carp or invasive species in general, but I do work with people like Nick Mandrak who have been doing some work on this. And, you talk, I understand the urgency of the situation, because I've read papers, some pretty high-profile papers indicate the potential changes could occur to the Great Lakes as a result of this, in the true definition of invasive, this could be the big one. But how you eradicate it, they exist right now. They're there, but they're at very low population densities. And it's very hard to eradicate something that's hard to catch.
No,
hard-
it
hard to
isn't.
get.
No.
Without
Canada's
doing
Department
further-
of Fisheries and Oceans know that when they are spawning and swimming up both the Sandusky and Maumee River, you put nets across the river, you capture them and kill them.
Well, but there are data show that there are some in the Great Lakes, not just in the Ohio River. We found them on the
They're in Lake
Canadian
Erie,
side
yes.
as well. So that's much more difficult to tackle.
But they all swim up rivers to spawn.
Yeah,
You
so some of the
simply
work that Nick Mandrak is doing, and that's why I mentioned that, and this gets to your research question, is he is looking at the spawning sites, and are there management actions that you can take related to the spawning sites that make it unfavorable for them to spawn, so that they're not able to do that.
But he
but
will
it
recommend
takes time.
eradication, and he
Time.
recommends putting nets and get all of the agencies involved in capturing them and killing
Yeah,
them.
he does recommend a more
Yes,
extreme view.
Yes.
That's true. I've talked to him about that.
yeah,
All right.
yeah.
I think just given the time, we'll take some more questions offline if people have some other questions. But I think just to be respectful of the congressman's time, we'll shift gears a bit and turn it over to the next phase of the plenary. So thanks everyone for the conversation. I think Paul and I are certainly happy to take questions on the margins after the plenary is done. Thanks everyone.
Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce Congressman Dan Kildee, who was born and raised in Flint, so a local boy, as it were, and a lifelong Michigander. Congressman Dan Kildee holds various leadership positions in Congress as Chief Deputy Whip, part of the Democratic leadership team in the 116th Congress. He acts as an important liaison among members of Congress and the leadership to build support for Democratic priorities and legislation. Congressman Kildee serves on the prestigious Ways and Means Committee, the oldest and one of the most powerful committees in the U.S. House of Representatives. On the committee, Congressman Kildee works to lower the costs of health care premiums and prescription drugs, protect Social Security and Medicare, negotiate fair trade deals, and create a tax system that benefits working families. The committee also has a vast jurisdiction over important programs including unemployment insurance, enforcement of child support laws, temporary assistance for needy families, and foster care and adoption programs. So obviously a very active individual. So it's my pleasure, and join me in welcoming Dan Kildee.
Well, thank you very much, and to all our Canadian cousins, welcome. It's good to have you here. The relationship between our two nations is defined by many things, but no, I think, stronger defining characteristic between the connection of the U.S. and Canada is defined by our shared responsibility, our shared stewardship of the greatest freshwater source on the planet. And actually, we always say the greatest freshwater source on the planet. And there are some scientists here. I don't know if any of you are astronomers. It's probably the greatest freshwater source in the known universe. We ought to just say that. I mean, why are we holding ourselves back? It's a really important responsibility that I take quite seriously. And I enjoyed listening to the discussion because I think there is, an unfortunate tendency among people in my line of work to think that you get smarter after you get elected to public office. there's a certain amount of evidence that the trend is in the opposite direction. I'm not a scientist, but I rely heavily upon and trust science in the decisions that we make. And I think there's often this sense that people in public policy, in the public policy arena, aren't attuned or versed enough in these questions that find their solutions really rooted in good science, that we ignore them. I think the truth is a little bit more nuanced than that. I think the problem, and the previous two speakers touched on this to an extent, the problem has more to do with the time frame over which we measure the quality and the value of the decisions that we make. If somehow I could wave a wand and change the way public decisions are made, there are lots of things I would like to do. In fact, right now, you might guess, I might make a couple of personnel changes. Setting that aside, if I could do one thing, and one thing only, to change the way public decisions are considered and taken, it would be to require somehow the time frame over which we measure the efficacy of our choices to be altered, so that we can only consider the most immediate consideration beginning, say, in a decade, and then some consideration for the next 50 years, but most of our consideration for the next century or more. It would change the way we view issues around infrastructure, around public education, around all the investments that we make in human capital, because the return on those investments very often is delayed for some period of time, particularly when it comes to educating young children. But there's no more profound an area where the better understanding of public policy and the way public policy is informed by science would have a dramatic effect if we were somehow forced to think about the implications of the choices we're making in the future and not relying on results to have to be fully delivered before the next balance sheet is written or before the next election is held. It's just a frighteningly short-sighted approach that all too often pervades the public policy decision-making process and is the reason that science is not as carefully considered in those calculations as they should be. Because very often, what science will inform us of is that the choices we're making may have some short-term cost, but has really incredible long-term value. And there's no, I think when we talk about the health and life of the Great Lakes, there's no, I think, better example of that. And I'll just take a couple of minutes because I know there's lots going on, but I want to touch on a couple of specific areas. You know, I'm very fortunate I have this district that includes my hometown of Flint, which I'm sure many of you know the recent history of that community and all the challenges that it faces, but I also have 118 miles of Lake Huron shoreline. So I take as a personal responsibility my effort to protect that. And one of the ways we've been trying to protect that from a policy standpoint is to make sure that our effort nationally in the US to restore the lakes, to make up for our poor stewardship in the past, is to fully fund those efforts to clean up the mess that we helped to create through the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And very often, I think when people think about or see what's happening in our national conversation, the assumption is that it is such a divisive environment, that it's such a caustic environment, that we can't seem to get together across partisan lines and across geography to solve problems. In this particular case, largely with help of a lot of people in this room who've been voices for this, we've been able to overcome that. And again, this past year, the 45 of us that are really invested in the Great Lakes, Democrats and Republicans, people across the states, members of Congress, got together to overcome what was a 90% cut in the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative proposed by the current president. And we overcame that. But it doesn't happen without voices. It doesn't happen just because we believe in it. We need the strength of the voices of people who understand their lakes, both in terms of the aesthetic value that they present, the economic value that they present, but also the need to apply good measures founded on good science to restore that which we have not managed so very well in the last several decades. So we overcame that, and I think that was a step in the right direction. The other point, two other things that I wanted to touch on, and then I don't know if you'll have time for questions or not, but I'd be happy to take any, even about the most difficult subject of all that's facing Congress right now, which is grass carp. No, two things. One, this question of invasives, we really do have to get it right in terms of how we deal with the questions surrounding Asian carp and the focus on Brandon Road in the Chicago suburbs. I was just there just a couple of months ago with a delegation of members of Congress to see that. But the issue of grass carp is one that we have to address. It's right in front of us. It's clear, and it's now. It's in this moment. And we are taking some steps. Like, for example, in this budget, I offered an amendment to increase the funding for eradication of grass carp in those areas where we know it's taking, where there is a presence of spawning sites in those rivers. Now, so we went from the $500,000 that I was able to get in last year's budget to $1 million, which only in Washington sounds like appropriators' dust. We need about $10 million based on what we know just about grass carp, just in those locations, to be able to fully fund an eradication effort that gets to the problem at the scale that is required. I think there are about 3 members of Congress that are aware of the threat that these species represent to the lakes. We hear a lot about the issues at Brandon Road and the dam and all the issues that we face there. Even that doesn't get the attention that it should. But what we need are voices to speak up and explain what the options and what the choices really are, and not wait for 100% certainty on 100% of the science, but make a decision based on what we know and act. Be willing to act based on the weight of the science. And this is what we can do right now, right here. So $1 million isn't a lot, but if we can focus that energy and increase that funding and make sure that we eradicate sooner rather than later, I think we will be far better off. So I guess one other point. You know, even though it is not presenting an immediate threat to the Great Lakes itself right now, the Great Lakes ecosystem, our surface water, our groundwater, certainly drinking water, is being threatened, and has been for a while, by chemical compounds that we are now becoming to understand are a real serious threat to human health, and that is this whole family of chemicals that we know as PFAS. I'm not sure how many of you have been working on this issue, but it's really one of those questions that is going to be a career for some people. It's going to be with us for some time. And what we need are more voices stepping up and helping explain what it means to have the weight of science, coming to the conclusion that we need to act on this, and not have science used, the process of scientific discovery being used against us in the struggle that we are in right now to try to fight against efforts to clean up these dangerous chemicals that are so present and so dangerous. And I say it this way. I was at a hearing just recently where members, leaders of the 3 principal companies producing these chemicals, almost in unison were saying that the science is unclear as to whether PFAS presents a threat to human health. I mean, how often have we heard science, sort of junk science, being used as an argument against efforts that are really supported by the overwhelming weight of scientific evidence. The reason it works, the reason it succeeds, is because if you're not at the table to refute that notion, to refute those claims, they are taken as fact by people who will search, people that I work with on a regular basis, who will search for any excuse to not take bold action in the aim of protecting public health and ultimately in the aim of protecting those industries that they want to coddle. Unless we speak up, unless our voices are heard, we're not going to win this fight. And so I'm really happy to hear the discussion taking place about the very necessary connection between the scientific community and policymakers, because that connection is not strong enough now, as we stand here right now. It is a challenge. It's a challenge that we face when it comes to protecting the Great Lakes. It's a challenge we face on all sorts of big public policy questions that I think will go the wrong way. Not just because we're not measuring the efficacy of our choices over the right time frame, but because it's far too convenient for far too many of the people I work with to take silence as acquiescence, to take silence as an admission that these outrageous claims that are being made, that the science is unclear, go unchallenged, and they allow themselves then the comfort of saying that nobody's telling them otherwise. So speak up, use your voices, tell your stories, inform the decisions that we make, knowing that it is an occasionally frustrating process. And when I say occasionally, I mean only on days that end with a Y. So thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for including me in this conversation. It's a really important discussion, comes at an absolutely critical time, and I really appreciate it. I don't know if you have time for a question or two, but I'd be happy to take whatever you'd like on any subject, on science or on political science, for that matter. Lunch is next, so let's do lunch. It's a scientific reality that people are getting hungry. But I'll be around actually for that lunch period. Please, the one serious request that I have is that your voices are more important now than ever, and you have to use them. You have to speak up. The choices that are being made right now are really dangerous. And without your voice, they're going to be allowed to go on a path that I think is really unfortunate, with the false comfort of somehow believing that what they're doing is okay, and it's not. Thank you all very, very much.
All right, thank you. Great plenary session. Hopefully everyone's primed and ready for more discussion over lunch and to really continue the battle, continue the debates. Your lunch tickets, again, are in your name badge, and we will see everyone back at 2 o'clock for more science sessions.